Velazquez, who is also the chair of the House Committee on Small Business, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for this important hearing. Professor Bonilla, I agree with you in terms of how poverty in Puerto Rico is directly linked to the colonial situation of Puerto Rico, and that Congress has a responsibility for resolving this issue. After following Hurricane Maria in 2017, under President Trump's leadership, HUD imposed unique restrictions and stalled almost $20 billion in federal disaster funding to Puerto Rico. President Biden has since removed this restriction, but can you explain how President Trump's decision to set up roadblocks and make it difficult for Puerto Rico to access disaster funding in 2017 has compounded its current recovery efforts?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. The Trump administration engaged in practices of over-scrutiny of applicants of color and put excessive barriers on applications for aid on behalf of both individuals and the Puerto Rican government. Some of these measures were placed in the name of preventing corruption, but it is important to mention that the only people who have been accused of corruption in the wake of Maria have been FEMA agents and contractors. The delay of federal aid and of federal assistance programs to which Puerto Ricans are fully entitled to as residents of the U.S. territories have caused an incalculable damage to a society that was already, as I mentioned, experiencing 40% of acute poverty, and that had already been facing measures of austerity that had dismantled the education system, public infrastructure, and other public services that were then unable to respond and be available to citizens in the time of immediate emergency. At the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, we call on greater scrutiny of these FEMA practices and of the practices of other government agencies that should be assisting Puerto Ricans in their time of need.
Thank you. Professor, one of the issues facing Puerto Rico after the most recent hurricane is the lack of specific data on how low-income Black and rural communities remain at a disadvantage on the island. What should Congress do to immediately address this information gap so it can enhance long-term investment in these communities?
Well, the first issue is that we need clarity on why certain government agencies just suddenly stop providing data for the territory. One example is the American Housing Survey, which just stopped being done in Puerto Rico after Maria at a time when this info was most necessary for documenting the challenges of local residents. A second example is the Household Pulse Survey, another important survey which not one territory has participated in. We also need greater data related to FEMA claims. It is difficult to know where and who was denied and who did not have access to aid. 60% of applicants were denied, and there is really no transparency as to how those decisions are made. I should also add that federal agencies should be working with local groups to make sure that the existing mechanisms are adequate for the territories. A primary example is the U.S. Census, which in 2020 suddenly added a race question in Puerto Rico with inadequate categories and inadequate education campaigns. So we really stress the need for that. Yes.
So although FEMA updated its policy last year to allow homeowners to self-certify their own ownership, reports from the ground indicate FEMA is wrongfully denying assistance to eligible survivors from Hurricanes Fiona and Ian. Wouldn't you agree it's not enough for FEMA to simply change its policy, but it also needs to act with recovery partners on the ground to ensure Puerto Rico homeowners get the assistance to which they are entitled?
Absolutely. We've seen that simply changing policy is not enough. The community organizations on the ground are reporting that we are seeing the exact same issues of lack of Spanish translation at FEMA sites, of lack of interpretation for deaf communities, and of over scrutiny and of a demand of documentation that is not actually necessary to apply for aid. As one of my colleagues in Puerto Rico says, FEMA must learn how to learn. That is, they cannot be impervious to change made at the top that are announced need to somehow trickle down so that we actually see them applied and in action. And we feel strongly that it is only by working in partnership with community watchdogs that we can actually ascertain if these changes are being implemented.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.